Well, welcome to part 2 of this. Not all is bliss in Americana culture. Let's get into this. It wasn't all a dream. Here's some key terms for your usage. The thing of the world I just described to you, the Americana dream in the previous lecture, the nuclear family, the prosperity, the middle classness, suburbia, all these things, they presumed that certain factors were playing in. And we're going to kind of disassemble some of this nostalgia for the 1950s and figure out who is this Americana? What are we envisioning, actually, when we're talking about Americana? What are we not imagining when we recall the Golden Age, as some people feel it is? So, Americana of the 1950s, the nostalgia for it, operates on the following beliefs. One, it presumes that all Americans are of the middle class and fully employed. Two, it assumes that all Americans pretty much lived in suburbs or things like suburbs. It assumes that all Americans are loyal to the government in all ways. You can be Democrat or Republican, but there are certain things you cannot be. There's an undertone there. All Americans are conforming to this ideal of nuclear family and traditional gender roles. That's another factor that plays in. There's also kind of this ignoring the fact that there's a Cold War, a global conflict brewing in the background. And one of the last variables, and this will become really apparent especially in our next unit, is that the American dream often assumed that you were of a particular European descent. But let's break down each of these bullet points one by one and understand them. So our first point is that all Americans are presumed to be of middle class and fully employed. We're not recalling that the rural Americans did not necessarily see much of the technological innovations coming in right away. The places that didn't necessarily have electricity or the medical access are the rural parts of America. You know, kind of where a lot of us live in this part of the country. With the end of World War II, many farmers lost the contracts for crops that the war effort needed. Additionally, a lot of the soldiers coming home, when those GI Bill unemployment terms ran out, many soldiers found life transitioning to be difficult. You'll notice that the Americana dream never talks about the war being a traumatic thing. It's war as a glorious thing. And so soldiers who kind of did not transition well from soldier life to civilian life, they were often pushed into the outskirts of this society. Not everyone transitions easily out of the war. Not everyone's middle class either, contrary to popular belief. We may aspire to be middle class in America, but that doesn't mean we all are. Assuming that all Americans live in suburbs or something like the burbs. What does this mean? Well, the rural Americans aren't living this dream. But essentially what happens is that many European Americans, they're called white for some simplification, are going to be leaving the cities in large numbers to move into these new developments, these new suburbs. This is going to amount to something called the white flight. Where downtown America would kind of be abandoned by the middle class, often white middle class. And as they left, they would they would be paying their taxes somewhere else into the suburbs. And downtown America would fall into decline as the wealthy and the middle class kind of flee for these new suburban projects. We're going to see the growth of urban sprawl around America. And in the downtown areas, There's going to be increases in crime, and that'll cause even people with more financial means to leave. And essentially what happens is the inner cities of America are left with a lot of the impoverished, the poor, and not necessarily the services or funds to address their issues. Assuming that everyone is loyal to the government and does not question the government is another issue that comes up. Well, America is a free society, a democratic society. There were some ideas during the Cold War that were simply not tolerated. Many Americans, guilty or not, were accused of being communists during the Second Red Scare. Basically, many people feared a communist takeover. If you remember my On Communism lecture, communism seeks to dismantle the current society and rebuild a new one. And so what happened is, it often amounted to witch hunts, though. And so because what happened is, groups like Hauk, which we'll learn more about later, would be looking for communism, and they'd say, well, I'm not a communist, they're a communist. And in trying to flush out the communists in these witch hunts, people would be accused of being communists, and it didn't really matter if it was true or not, because once you got the label of being a communist, people assumed you were guilty. This led to humiliation, loss of jobs, being drugged through a whole process of basically being degraded, and in some cases it led people to commit suicide, and it destroyed many people's lives while hunting for these mythical communists that were infiltrating American society. There were communists infiltrating American society. Don't get that wrong. It's just that the witch hunts to find them were not very good at finding real communists. But we'll talk about that in a separate activity. This one's a big one, especially for women's history. The Americana of the 1950s assumes that all Americans are conforming to the ideal nuclear family and traditional roles of gender. Women who wanted to do something other than be a homemaker were often looked down upon. Sexism is prevalent in many industries, and hiring preferences and higher wages were given to men under the argument of they're the breadwinner, they're the primary income maker of the nuclear family, and therefore they should be paid more. This kind of ignores the idea that very few middle-class jobs necessarily pay enough to support the consumption habits of an American family. And so the idea that the woman could be a homemaker and not have to go out and work, was really not possible for many working-class families and families who just did not have fathers in, quote-unquote, the professions that paid that well. But the other thing is, while we look back on rock and roll fondly, you have to remember that rock and roll was seen as a degenerate activity by common American culture in the 1950s. Beatniks were another group that saw Americans as being increasingly conformist. They questioned the American society as a totality, and they kind of said, look, you're projecting this America on us. We want to do our own thing. We want to have our own beat, march to the beat of our own drum, metaphorically speaking. And so many beatniks felt that America was lacking individualism and conforming too much. Hollywood will capture this spirit in a movie called Rebel Without a Cause. Actually, that film is one of the reasons why T-shirts are popular as a fashion statement. One other thing that is kind of overlooked is the fact that the world could have ended at any moment during the Cold War, especially as nuclear weapons got better and better. We cover this more in a separate lecture, but it's about nukes. But all throughout the Cold War, every American, man, woman, child, knew that in under an hour, the world could be destroyed. all of the things that they had bought, the lives they had built, could be leveled in a flash of a nuclear blast. Likewise, every Soviet man, woman, and child knew that this could be a problem for them as well. And even if you weren't in the Soviet Union or you weren't in the U.S., you were in one of the non-aligned countries, everyone knew that if the Soviets and the U.S. ever decided to settle their disputes with a hot war as opposed to a cold war, there wouldn't be much of a world left after World War III. Radiation and whatnot. Existential dread is going to pervade from, especially after the Soviets get the bomb, all the way through the entire Cold War. There's always this thought in the back of everyone's heads, this could end at any minute. It's kind of hard to capture in the modern era. It's hard for people like me who came after the Cold War to truly understand. But this last point is probably one of the big ones. This will set the stage for the next unit we study, the civil rights and the era of change and the Vietnam era. Essentially, the American dream, the Americana of the 1950s, assumes you're white, European descent. Now, according to the U.S. Constitution in this time period, all Americans, all African Americans, are equal and full citizens in the United States of America. In practice, that was not the case. Jim Crow laws were a part of the culture, society, and just entrenched into particularly Southern culture. But racism was an issue in other parts of the country, particularly in the North as well. But what this brings us up to is the concept of de facto segregation, where businesses and private entities often segregated blacks and whites. African Americans were often not allowed to sit in certain seats at restaurants. They weren't allowed to use certain machines at the laundromat. Certain movie theaters were denied access to them. Public transit was segregated. And African Americans were treated as separates in American society. Often these facilities were often not as well maintained because maintaining bathrooms in quadruplet instead of men, women, you had to have men, women, whites only, and then men, women, blacks only. When you had all these facilities, it was hard to maintain them, and so often due to racism, the African Americans portions of various facilities were not as high a quality. This practice of segregation and de facto segregation deeply demeaned African Americans, because if you're recalling World War II propaganda, the war effort, America stated that it was the leader of the free world, and yet you couldn't sit anywhere at the lunch. You couldn't sit anywhere you wanted at the lunch counter during rush hour. But we're going to revisit the African American challenge in a future unit on the civil rights movement. But the thing to keep in mind is that the racial relations of the 1950s are going to set up the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Essentially in the 60s, enough is enough. African Americans begin arguing that I'm part of the Americana dream too. That is what's essentially what the civil rights movement is going to start with. But with Native Americans, we have the termination policy. Essentially, if you recall from U.S. history too, the U.S. government was dealing more with Native Americans as tribal entities, as members of tribes. The termination policies of the 1950s essentially state, nope, we're dealing with Native Americans as individuals, not as tribes. And instead of a group that is separate, they're being treated through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, they're being treated as individuals who need to assimilate into American culture, wider American culture. Part of this is done through the termination policy of sending many Native Americans into the cities to live the urban life that increasingly more and more Americans are living. But often the termination policy and the assimilation policy overlook the needs, wants, and interests of individual Native Americans. in favor of just assimilating them into wider American society. But moving on to another group, Latin Americans also see a great deal of discrimination and poor working conditions. In the cities, there's the discrimination, especially out in the Sun Belt. In the rural areas, there's a great deal of discrimination. Many Mexicans brought in into the U.S. under the Bracero program found harsh working conditions on farmlands, particularly. There were rampant violations of child labor laws, and exploiting the fact that since these workers could not speak English, they were not aware of their rights as workers in America. This was a problem that we would see in this time period. We can look back on the 1950s with fondness, but we should not forget that the undercurrent that I've just talked about. Nostalgia isn't necessarily evil, and for many Americans, the 1950s were an era of unprecedented prosperity. On average, all Americans, be them African American or white European Americans, they saw improvements. It's just that the rates of improvements are up for debate. And this kind of brings us to this important thing of memory versus the events that happened. The vision of Americana from Part 1, The Golden Age, is a rose-tinted view. It operates on the assumptions we talked about, like socioeconomics, race, and fitting into the perceived one-size-fits-all vision of the American dream. As students of history, however, we need to keep in mind that history is a combination of how we remember the past and how the past actually happened. And so we can't dismiss the fact that America was prosperous in the 1950s. Not everyone was benefiting from that prosperity, however, and that's what we need to keep in mind when especially looking at the second part. But in some ways, the civil rights movement that will follow is an argument of American prosperity is an equal prosperity that should be available to all. And that's kind of where that argument comes from. But that's a lot to take in. In any case, the present is built on perceptions and the realities of the past, and what we do with them is what's going to make the future. I think I'm going to end things here now, and until later.